desert of California, NASA tests an experimental rocket plane, the X-15. They want to put a man into space, and they're in a hurry.
Rockets were powering aircraft to higher and higher speeds. The X-15 had enough energy to zoom to altitudes above the atmosphere.
The X-15 flies so high, pilots experience weightlessness and look out into the darkness of space. But even at 600,000 horsepower, it would need to fly 4 times its top speed to put a man into orbit. The Soviet Union holds an early lead in the space race, launching the first unmanned satellite to orbit the Earth. To beat the Soviets, NASA must launch a man into Earth orbit. Only rockets can go fast enough, more than 17,000 miles per hour. They call the program Project Mercury, and rally a team of determined young scientists and engineers to figure out how to fly a military missile with a man on top.
Most of us came in from aircraft flight test. We knew nothing about rocketry, we knew nothing about spacecraft, we knew nothing about orbits.
Gene Kranz joins the flight directors team in NASA's earliest days.
So it was a question of learning to drink from a fire hose. We had to learn all about trajectories. I'd never heard the term retrofire, coming on down from orbit, getting the spacecraft backbone.
No man has ever survived a vertical blastoff on top of a rocket. At first, even stuntmen are considered for the job.
There were suggestions they'd take people like Evel Knievel or race drivers or something like that. And then President Eisenhower just said he'd rather have it be military test pilots.
110 pilots qualify. NASA selects the top 7.
These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
The Mercury 7 astronauts become instant celebrities. The press follows their every move.
You knew these guys. You lived with these guys. You socialized with them. They were the story. Wallace Schirra made the best textbook flight of them all. Alan Shepard, extremely smart. Scott Carpenter, the first scientist astronaut. Gordo Cooper, the best pilot of the bunch. Deke, great human being in every way. Gus Grissom, engineering savvy. John Glenn, probably the most level-headed.
To carry the first astronaut safely into space, NASA designs a pressurized capsule. The one-man spacecraft replaces a nuclear warhead as the payload for a Redstone missile.
I saw a lot of rockets launched. I'd say that somewhere between 30 and 40% of them failed. A lot of them came up off the pad and went the opposite direction. Some of them got halfway off the pad and blew up. Some of them got to 10,000 feet and turned the other way and blew up.
We're looking at this thing and looking at each other and deciding we want to go back and talk to the engineers a little more before we go further.
Engineers make the rockets more reliable for manned flight. But doctors still aren't convinced the man on top will be able to function in the weightlessness of space.
There was grave doubt in about 98% of the medical community that the man could perform a task when flying at zero gravity, that he would have trouble seeing, that he would have trouble swallowing, he would have trouble breathing, he would have trouble talking. We had to prove to the medical community that man would survive in the first place.
It's not made public, but John Glenn, Alan Shepard, and Gus Grissom are on NASA's short list to be America's first man in space.
We were all very competitive. We wanted to get those first flights.
The rocket and capsule are finally ready to fly. But none of the astronauts are happy about NASA's choice. A specially trained chimpanzee named Ham will fly the next Mercury mission. NASA's medical team sends Ham as a final test that man can function in zero-G.
The only
Ham blasts off on a suborbital mission into space.
3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff.
While weightless, Ham's put through a series of tests and performs well. Physically, he's unaffected by zero-G. His mission proves man can function in space. He's fatigued, dehydrated, but generally in good shape. But doubts remain about the reliability of the rockets, and they still don't know who will fly first.
It had been a big mystery for a long time. Who's going to fly first?
The director of the Manned Spacecraft Center finally reveals his choice.
Alan Shepard was chosen to be the first because he was considered to be the smartest of the 7 astronauts. They felt if Alan on the first one, if anything went wrong, he was more apt to be able to analyze or fix or do or get it out of it.
After more tests and more delays, NASA still hopes to put the first man in space.
We have done everything we know how to do to make this as safe as we can make it. We're done with all the tests, so we stand around and look at each other one last time and ask, okay, are we really ready to light this candle? Eventually, the answer to that has to be yes.
Alan Shepard's suborbital mission finally has a launch date, May 2nd. But on April 12th, NASA receives stunning news. The Soviet Union puts a man into orbit and brings him back alive. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man in space just 20 days before Shepard is scheduled to fly.
We were all very angry about not being able to fly as quickly as we could have, and we would have beaten Gagarin into space had we done that.
Al was not pleased at all. He was very disappointed that he was not to be the first spaceman.
May 5th, 1961, 2:40 a.m. Shepard's pre-flight medical. After 3 days of delays, the final countdown has begun.
He was a cool cat.
But Alan Shepard was an educated daredevil. Everybody was praying Alan could survive in space.
Inboard cutoff. Inboard engines out. I'm inboard cutoff.
It was very exciting, very frightening to see a man come out of the trailer that he was in, to look up at that vehicle, to ride the elevator up, and then wait for us to get ready to launch.
5:21 a.m. Technicians strap him into the capsule. Shepard's only link to the world is Deke Slayton, the mission's Capcom, or capsule communicator. In the Atlantic, the Navy prepares for Shepard's recovery. 45 million Americans watch the launch live. Local beaches offer a front row seat.
Everybody, including myself, came here. We came any way we could. Everybody was praying and pushing for Alan Shepard.
TM is go.
We have a momentary hold.
As the countdown progressed, we had frustrations. They had problems with the spacecraft hatch. And Alan Shepard was getting impatient.
4 hours later, Shepard is losing his cool.
I'm over to Chase. Okay, if you would like to, I'll get an estimate.
You could see Alan Shepard's heart rate go up, and it reached above 200. Lord knows what my heart rate was.
There's nothing wrong with being frightened. It makes you do a better job.
But no one at Mission Control wants to give the final go for launch.
All of us were extremely apprehensive. We had never had a human being on the top side of a rocket.
Okay, to resume the count. TE, I'm going to turn it over.
It's Alan Shepard who decides they've waited long enough.
Finally, he says, let's light this candle. Let's go.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
He had one single-line prayer that he said just before ignition.
1.
Don't mess this up. But he didn't say mess.
All right, lift off and the clock is started.
It was sort of like the first hit in a football game.
When that Mercury redstone rose above the tree line, cars stopped. People got out, hit their knees, and literally prayed.
This is Freedom 7, the fuel.
We saw that guy go, and we could track him for about the first 20 seconds as he went up through powered flight and then back down at the consoles and look at the data and listen to the calls.
Pressure is holding at 5.5. Cabin holding at 5.5.
He is disappearing. Here's a man going over 100 miles into space.
Cabin 5.5.
He looks so lonely up there.
This is okay.
5 minutes after liftoff, Alan Shepard becomes America's first man in space.
Roger, okay. Yaw is okay. Switching manual roll.
Shepard's suborbital flight reaches 116 miles above the Earth, then descends.
Okay. Okay, this is Freedom 7. Everyone fly-by-wire going to re-entry attitude.
Retro, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Start retro sequence. In retro attitude, hard green. Retro 1.
NASA still fears the high G-forces or extreme temperatures of re-entry could kill him.
Retro 3. Okay, 3 retros have fired. Retro jettison is back to arm.
There was no question. We were sweating bullets.
Oxygen, go. All systems are go. Please build up. 3, 6, 9. This is 7. Okay. 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 This is 7. Okay.
Mission Control loses radio contact with Shepard during re-entry.
Freedom 7, this is Indian Capcom. Do you read me? Seven, this is Indian Capcom. Do you read me?
In Mission Control, we're absolutely helpless.
Freedom 7, this is Indian Capcom. Do you read me? Seven, this is Indian Capcom. Do you read me?
Hello, Capcom. Freedom 7. Main chute is coming unraised and it looks good. The rate of descent is reading about 35 feet per second. Oh, roger.
The mission only lasted about 20 minutes. But this was the purest, happiest 20 minutes of our entire life.
It just hit the water a moment ago. A cheer went up from the ship company watching here from all decks on the aircraft carrier.
I think he proved without a question in anybody's mind that man indeed could perform almost any task in a spacecraft.
This was our first man in space. And it was total joy.
Just 20 days later, President John Kennedy sets a new goal for America's space program.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
This young president of ours gets up and says, we're going to go to the moon and we're going to land there and we're going to bring the people back home within the decade. I was staggered, or stunned, or overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge.
The first American has barely reached space, and NASA still hasn't put a man into orbit. But the countdown to the end of the decade has begun.
We had the knowledge, the moxie, and the will to not only catch up, but surpass and beat them in the business of spaceflight.
NASA wants to put another man into space in a hurry, to prove Shepard's mission was no fluke.
They figure Gus Grissom is the engineer, so Gus will make the second flight, and he'll be looking at for engineering question.
But the intense training prepares them to do very little actual flying in space. 7 of the world's best pilots want a spacecraft they can control.
Gus was somewhat frustrated because the people that were putting this together were trying to make it so that the astronaut really had nothing to do. He was just riding in this thing.
It took a while to convince the pilots that we wanted to use their talents in making the machine better.
We split up the duties in the group itself. One of my duties was on cockpit layout, organizing your instrument panel so you get the information when you need it. Deke was going to follow booster development for us. Scott, I think, was on navigation and how we're going to keep track of where this thing is. Gus Grissom had a whole recovery effort in organizing the Navy. So each of us had sort of a specialty area like that.
NASA redesigns the capsule. Grissom will have greater control over the flight of his spacecraft and a new explosive escape hatch. Grissom names his capsule Liberty Bell 7. It has another important new feature.
In the original spacecraft design, there was no window. The reason was that that was going to add weight. Not only the window itself, which had to be thick, but the support structure around it. And weight was critical.
10 weeks after Alan Shepard's flight, Gus Grissom is ready for a second suborbital mission. Shepard is Grissom's Capcom.
Roger, this is Liberty Bell 7. The clock is operating. Loud and clear, Jose. Don't cry too much. Okie doke. Capsule has separated. The capsule is coming around into orbit attitude. Such a fascinating view out the window, you just can't help but look out that way. I understand. Okay, it's a nice ride up to now. Loud and clear. Roger. Atlantic Ship Capcom, this is Liberty Bell 7. I read you loud and clear, over.
15 minutes and 37 seconds after blastoff, nearly a bullseye splashdown.
Liberty Bell 7, do you have any word from the recovery troops?
The capsule had landed in the water. At that point, we thought it had gone well.
Your entry in the water will be over you in just about 30 seconds from it. Roger,
Tower, Bell 7. Your status looks good. Your systems look good. Over.
It was the joy of having a successful mission. Came off like a piece of cake.
You ready to come in, hook on anytime? Roger, we're ready anytime you are.
Gus was sitting there minding his own business, and all at once it was pow. The hatch blew, and water started coming in over the side.
The capsule starts sinking. Grissom has only moments to escape.
All right, observe something from the water alongside capsule.
The spacesuit is designed to keep him afloat.
He had forgot to close one of the valves in his suit, and it was letting water in.
No longer a life preserver, the suit fills with water and drags him under. Unaware Gus Grissom's in trouble, helicopter pilot Jim Lewis tries to save the sinking capsule first.
We almost had it free and out, but every time it came out, a wave would come along and grab it and pull it back down.
In mission control, we were absolutely helpless. We were watching the helicopter trying to grapple and lift the spacecraft up. And we could see Gus struggling out there in the rotor wash. And in mission control, a lot of us were saying, forget the spacecraft. Get Gus, get Gus, get Gus.
Suddenly, Lewis has another problem. A warning light indicates his engine is overheating.
Normally when that happened, you had about 5 minutes worth of engine power before experiencing an engine failure. I didn't want Gus in my aircraft in the event that we lost the engine.
We were going to lose him.
A second chopper rushes in to pick up Grissom as Lewis struggles with the capsule. Grissom is safe, but Liberty Bell 7 and all its invaluable data are lost.
The entire spacecraft sank in 3 miles of water, which was deeper than the Titanic. And we had no vehicles that were capable of doing the recovery.
We lost the spacecraft, but we got our crewmen back.
Gus was destroyed about losing his capsule.
He said that that was the only craft that he ever lost.
President Kennedy congratulates Grissom, but suborbital flights aren't enough. America is still coming in second in the race for space. And NASA still hasn't fulfilled the primary goal of Project Mercury, launching a man into orbit and bringing him home alive. In his capsule, Friendship 7, John Glenn will attempt NASA's first orbital mission.
We lived in a motel about 15 miles south of the Space Center. And every morning when we'd get ready to come out to work, we'd go and look and see if the searchlights were on the launch pad. If the searchlights were on, we felt pretty confident driving in because somebody was out there doing something and the countdown was more than likely progressing. You felt, okay, we're going for it, we're gonna get it today.
NASA needs more power to put a spacecraft into orbit. The larger Atlas rocket will blast Glenn 162 miles above the Earth at a speed of 17,500 miles an hour. Glenn will orbit the Earth 3 times. NASA's biggest concern, Shepard and Grissom were weightless for 5 minutes. Glenn will be weightless for nearly 5 hours.
Someone had predicted that in zero-G, your eyes no longer needed to be supported by the structure under the eye, and that your eye would gradually change shape in orbit. Your eye might change enough you'd have trouble seeing the instrument panel.
Stand by for an instrument. Roger. Stand by, Bermuda. There will be no smoking and blockouts until
T-7. We may have it by then. Roger.
I'd been through all of that, 11 scheduled dates and 3 times up there. So when it finally came, it was almost a surprise to go.
Are you ready to continue? We just got to go.
When you're out there and you're actually on the launch pad, there's no way to simulate that.
Green. Okay, go ahead, Cape. Your attention, please. On my mark, we will pick up the count.
More than 50,000 people watch from nearby Cocoa Beach.
We reporters would watch from the beaches then because they wouldn't let us in. But we kept banging at the gates and kicking at the fences. They said they're more of a nuisance outside and they'll be on the inside, so they finally let us in. It was just the greatest place in the world.
100 million people across America watch the countdown live.
T-minus 15 minutes. Mark.
When it came time to go, the whole world was with me.
All recorders too fast. T-minus 18 seconds and counting.
I was the communicator for the countdown. I wanted to say something like bon voyage, buddy, have a good time, and also enlist the aid of our maker in protecting him.
Godspeed, John Glenn. Cap.
I was expecting somebody to say a launch hold of some kind.
3, 2, 1, 0.
And I couldn't believe it.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway. You're loud and clear.
The excitement of John Glenn going into orbit. This was the adventure of the 20th century.
The moment when the final Atlas engine will shut down, when Friendship 7 should separate from the booster rocket and begin orbital flight.
7, Cape is go. We're standing by for you. Roger, Cape is go and I am go. Our capsule is in good shape.
After all the dire predictions of what might happen and how you might feel in space in zero-G, and there wasn't any problem at all.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around.
Of course, in the Mercury spacecraft, there wasn't any place to float to. You were just in there, you're in a cockpit, you're strapped in. The most you could do would be loosen the straps to be a little more comfortable. I was elated feeling of zero-G and seeing how things work and seeing whether you could swallow. Nothing prepares you for the view as you look outside. You can see the curvature of the Earth's surface and whole nations just at a glance.
Oh, that view is tremendous.
Everything was going so well that it was beyond belief that it could go that easily.
But as Glenn completes his first orbit, Mission Control confronts its first crisis in space.
Capcom on HF, 7 anything to report on control system checks?
The telemetry people noticed a signal which was indicating that the heat shield had come loose. It was very scary to me. If indeed the heat shield was loose, during re-entry, the spacecraft would probably get very hot, temperatures of 3,000 degrees. The heat might burn off the heat shield, and it would have killed him. We ran a few tests to see if what we were seeing was correct. We began to ask him questions.
Do I feel any bumping or something like that? So it's quite obvious they weren't telling me exactly what they were thinking on the ground.
If the problem is real, the straps for the retro rockets are the only thing holding the heat shield in place.
We are recommending that you leave the retro package on through the entire re-entry. Do you have any reason, over? Not at this time. This is the judgment of Cape Flight. Roger, say again.
John didn't like not being told what was wrong with the machine that he was flying.
The reason we didn't was because there wasn't anything he could do about it.
I think the astronaut needs to know everything they know on the ground. If you lost communications, the astronaut should have all the information.
The engineers quietly hope the straps hold until the capsule hits denser air. Then the force of descent should keep the heat shield in place.
2, 1, fire. Roger. Retros are firing.
But when I first started re-entry and the retro rockets fired, the straps that held that retro pack onto the basic spacecraft itself burned off. There were burning chunks coming back by the window. Sort of a thump on the spacecraft.
This is Friendship 7. I think the pack just let go. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? This is Friendship 7, a real fireball outside.
During re-entry, ionized plasma builds up around the spacecraft, causing a radio blackout for about 3 minutes. The world waits to hear if John Glenn is alive.
Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? 7, this is Cape. Transmitting blind. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Keep talking, Al. Friendship 7, this is Cape. How do you read? Over. 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over. Roger, reading loud and clear. How you doing? My condition is good, but that was a real fireball, boy.
The heat shield was not loose.
It was a microswitch malfunction.
Hello, Mercury recovery. This is Friendship 7. Do you receive? Steel is loud and clear. Right here, Steelhead.
With Glenn's orbital flight, the U.S. finally catches up to the Soviet Union. John Glenn instantly becomes one of America's greatest heroes.
We'd been concentrated so much on this mission for so long and just didn't think much about anything else. And then to have it over was really a big relief.
After John's flight, we were all proud. I was proud of him. We were all proud of the United States for doing it.
It was proof positive that this country could compete in the world of spaceflight, and that the Russians indeed were not ahead of us.
Some months ago, I said that I hoped that every American would serve his country. Today, Colonel Glenn served his, and we all express our thanks to him. We have a long way to go in the space race, but this is the new ocean, and I believe the United States must sail on it and be in a position second to none.
The U.S. is on track to fulfill Kennedy's dream. Yet orbital flight is just one small step. Now NASA must begin to explore the hostile territory of space. In his capsule, Aurora 7, Scott Carpenter will fly next.
John's flight was an experimental test flight. Mine was to be more of a scientific investigation. There were visibility experiments. There were capsule maneuvering tasks that were new. It was a very busy flight plan.
Scott Carpenter, I call him a romanticist. He was interested in the beauty of space, sunrise and the sunset.
I remember just spinning a camera a little and letting it go and watch it stay right there. That's an amazing sight. The view and the weightlessness, things do look different. The stars don't twinkle anymore. There's no atmosphere. It's an addictive sight.
He was distracted many times during the flight.
I have white particles in view below the capsule. They look exactly like snowflakes.
For the first time, conflicts arise between the astronaut and mission control.
He kept using the fuel in a cavalier fashion. He was maneuvering the spacecraft to look here, there, and everywhere at sites that he wanted to see. Frankly, I can understand that.
There was a requirement for me to expend more fuel because of the observations I wanted to make.
During the first revolution, he used up the fuel in the automatic control system almost completely. We told him to stop using that system. He got to the manual system and used up all but about 10 or 20% of the manual fuel.
Roger, I am go for orbit 3.
When he came up on retrofire, the fuel had been almost entirely depleted.
I didn't have any fuel. The thrusters were not working.
For re-entry, Carpenter has to manually turn the capsule 180 degrees so the heat shield faces down. But he has another problem. An automatic attitude sensor used to align the capsule is off by nearly 40 degrees, and only Carpenter knows it.
He did not tell us that, and we had no way of knowing on the ground there was this bias there.
Now he's got to fire the retro rockets manually.
Gyros are off. You'll have to use attitude bypass, man, and manual override. Roger.
With a faulty sensor, Carpenter's already off target. If he's not positioned perfectly, the heat shield down, the capsule will burn up.
You subject the capsule to heating, and that could be catastrophic, fatal. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, fire 1, fire 2, and fire 3. I hope we have enough fuel. I get the orange glow at this time.
Mission Control loses contact with Carpenter during the radio blackout.
Aurora 7, keep Capcom, over.
3 minutes later, nothing.
Aurora 7, keep Capcom, over. Aurora Capcom, he's pretty far down range. Aurora 7, keep Capcom, over.
After 40 minutes, still not a word from Scott Carpenter. The press is already speculating that NASA has lost its first astronaut.
Aurora 7, keep Capcom, over. Flight network. Go ahead. Source through Antigua reports they see life raft with Carpenter inside, alongside the capsule.
Finally, reconnaissance flights locate Carpenter 250 miles off target.
Nobody knew where I was after my flight, but I knew exactly where I was.
Carpenter floats in the Atlantic for 3 hours.
Nothing worked exactly the way it should have, but we brought back some interesting new information in spaceflight.
Scott Carpenter achieves all his mission objectives, yet flight controllers think many of the problems he faced could have been avoided. 5 months later, Wally Schirra flies 6 orbits. Then Gordo Cooper circles the Earth 22 times over a day and a half.
Hello, this is astronaut Gordon Cooper speaking from Faith 7.
Cooper becomes the first American to sleep in space and the last to orbit solo around the Earth.
Roger, look good here, Gordo. Roger, feels good, buddy.
As Project Mercury comes to an end, Project Gemini is already preparing to blast off with a bold new goal for America's exploration of space.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
The Mercury program was the most challenging of all the work that we've ever done in space. To a great extent, the Mercury astronauts were literally flying by the seat of their pants.
There's nothing I think could prepare us for that kind of an experience. I've been very fortunate.
We were all for one and one for all.
The Mercury astronauts took the first heroic steps into a new frontier. In Project Gemini, they'll learn how to fly to the moon.
The flights to the moon were going to take 10 days.
We had to learn how to live in space.
Could they operate all right in zero gravity?
How do we even get to the moon?
Gemini missions will carry 2 men, something NASA has never attempted. NASA announces a second group of astronauts. They call themselves the New 9.
There were 9 of us, 4 from the Air Force, 3 from the Navy, and 2 civilians. And they were a really good group of people.
Great bunch of guys. I liked all of them. We really had a great group.
Many of America's most famous astronauts start out in Project Gemini. Jim Lovell, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong. 10 Gemini missions are planned, each more challenging and more dangerous than the last.
Throughout this entire process, the risk was constantly escalating on each one of these missions.
So is the competition among the astronauts. At stake, the ultimate prize, to be the first man on the moon.
We were all extremely competitive. And so from a competition standpoint, we were right in there all the time,
I was bulletproof, invincible. There's nothing I couldn't do. Just give me a shot. Don't tell me I can't do it, because I can do it. To do what we do, you have to be a little arrogant.
NASA announces the crew for America's first 2-man flight into space. Rookie astronaut John Young.
My wife didn't want me to fly. She thought I'd get killed. I didn't think I would.
Flying in space next to Young, Project Mercury veteran Gus Grissom.
My friend. He's a great guy. Very, very great guy. He and I first spent time together when we were doing survival training down in Panama.
John Young and Gus Grissom, 2 of the most perfectly paired crew members that I've ever seen. They seem to have a zest for space. They were kids at heart. It's almost like they were going off on a joyride there.
To lift the new 2-man capsule into space, NASA needs a more powerful rocket. The Air Force is developing a new Titan missile. But adapting it for Gemini missions won't be easy. One out of every 5 Titans fails. An 80% success rate isn't good enough if men are going to ride it into space.
Well, it wasn't perfect.
A rocket is like a controlled explosion that is looking for any weakness that it can find to get out.
I remember sitting watching TV with my mother and father one day when they were going to show a live launch down at the Cape, and the thing just barely got off the pad when it blew up. Of course, that wasn't exactly a confidence builder for my mother and dad.
Engineers check and recheck every part and install redundant systems throughout the rocket to make it more reliable. Finally, NASA launches 2 rockets that don't explode. Gus Grissom and John Young will ride the next Titan missile into space. Gemini 3's mission objectives: test drive the new rocket and capsule and return to Earth alive.
Thousands of people across the country, various places, they're all going through this building of the excitement heading towards the launch and this examination of conscience as to whether all that should be done has been done and nothing has been forgotten. It's almost like the force is with you.
Stage 2 pre-valve is coming open, 5 seconds. T-minus 20 seconds, mark.
We were all kind of holding our breath to make sure they got up there and did all the things they were supposed to do.
It was white knuckle time in mission control.
Anything goes wrong, and Grissom and Young will be killed, with millions of people watching. Gemini 3 is a go for launch.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4.
And think about your procedures that you're going to run. Frightened? Never thought about it.
2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff. Roger, talk to me. We got a roll program. Roger, roll. Good liftoff, 8.
That was a pretty good launch. Had quite a few Gs going into orbit. Piece of cake.
It was as close as we could get to perfection. The launch went perfectly. The spacecraft performed admirably. It went swimmingly.
Grissom and Young ride a converted ballistic missile. For the first time, 2 Americans fly together in space. They practice changing altitude and orbit, critical maneuvers on a trip to the moon. Waiting for the capsule in the Atlantic, a recovery task force. 27 ships, 126 aircraft.
And we screwed up on re-entry. When we fired the retro rockets, we forgot that the Earth rotated under us. We forgot to put the rotation of the Earth into the equation.
As a result, Gemini 3 splashes down off target.
We were short. We were 60 miles short. We were, when we started, we were 190 miles short, and Gus made out about 60 miles of it.
After 3 orbits of the Earth, waiting to be rescued is the worst part of the mission for Gus Grissom.
He was a little seasick, you know. I was an old Navy guy, so I had nothing. I've been on a destroyer for a year, so nothing made me seasick.
Crowds fill lower Manhattan to welcome their heroes home.
It was raining and snowing, and we were sitting there in an open car. As an old Texas boy, I don't think being in the snow is much fun. But that's what we did.
NASA has less than 5 years to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Every Gemini mission will test a critical procedure in the flight plan to get there. The next big challenge is walking in space, an extravehicular activity, or EVA.
EVA was a key element that had to be accomplished successfully before we could go onto the moon.
We had to learn about what it's like to get out of a spacecraft, whether it's floating around the Earth or whether it's walking on a moon. We had to learn how to live in space.
The biggest unknown, how effective the human body can be when weightless. NASA engineers devise a way to cheat gravity. It's called the Vomit Comet, a specially modified plane that flies in huge arcs. As it climbs steeply, then drops, the astronauts experience up to 30 seconds of weightlessness. So far, astronauts have been strapped to the seat. No one knows what will happen when they try to move around.
We could push off from the back end and actually swim all the way through the length of the airplane. We took things up to test, and I enjoyed that particular area of training the Vomit Comet.
A lot of people got sick doing that. It was sort of like seasickness squared.
I really didn't look forward to going into the vehicle again. I said, I don't need that vehicle.
Zero gravity is only one problem. There are other dangers waiting outside the capsule. The spacesuit is the astronaut's last line of defense against the extreme conditions in space.
You'd be 250 degrees plus on the sunny side, and when spacecraft rotated and you were in the shade, that you're minus 250 degrees. Well, the suit had to be designed to work in that kind of environment.
Space is a vacuum. If the flight suit fails, or even tears a little, the difference in pressure would cause the astronaut's blood to boil, killing him instantly.
The suit was designed to keep us alive. Now, it was risky, and we accepted the risk. We didn't become astronauts to play it safe.
NASA's plan: fly 2 more missions, building to an EVA on Gemini 6. But nobody at NASA knows a Soviet cosmonaut has already walked in space.
And it shocked a lot of people. It caught us totally unexpected, and we were just barely flying in space in our own little capsules. They weren't even big enough to be called spaceships.
The news changes everything.
It meant I was going to have to work my ass off to get it done on the next flight.
I was called over to Chris Kraft, and basically he told me the NASA administration had decided we're going to try to conduct an EVA, but then he said, but I want you to do it in secret.
Okay,
stand by for final status check.
The Soviets were still beating us every step of the way, and they didn't want to advertise we were going to do something unless they were absolutely sure that we were capable of accomplishing it.
The man who gets the job to leave the capsule and walk in space is rookie astronaut Ed White.
Ed White was, if we had a Boy Scout in the space program, I think Ed White epitomized what a Boy Scout really is. He was probably what everyone thought an astronaut should be.
White's partner on Gemini 4 is Jim McDivitt. At NASA, they're known as the Gemini Twins.
I knew Ed White for a long time. We had gone to University of Michigan together. We lived on the same street. Our kids knew each other. We went through the test pilot school in the same class. Ed and I were very close. We were extremely close friends.
Gemini 4 will also be America's longest spaceflight yet. 4 days, 62 orbits.
Putting an EVA into any flight for the first time is a bold step. But, that was part of the mission. In those days, we were taking big steps. It was a risky business.
If Ed White's EVA is successful, it will move the entire space program closer to the moon. But many think NASA is moving too fast. A problem on the EVA could keep the U.S. from getting to the moon on Kennedy's schedule.
NASA scrambled around and they kind of hurriedly, and in my estimation, without a great deal of safety factor, had Ed go EVA on Gemini 4. I was not in favor of it.
Even at NASA, few people know Gemini 4 is accelerating America's first spacewalk.
Our EVA was very confidential at the time. We had not announced we were going to do this, and we were doing all of our training at night, and only a group of maybe 30 or 40 people even knew we were going to try it.
NASA announces the first American spacewalk just a few days before the launch of Gemini 4.
The launch time is a very critical time. Everybody's keyed up. Everybody's got to do a good job. The hardware's got to work. Walking out my first thought was, my God, this is just like I saw on television. But you got your mind on other things. I was probably going over the launch things I had to do, and you're not thinking about girls and, and comic strips. It's the business.
We have a roll program initiated.
8.5 Gs, you're really being pushed into the seat, and all of a sudden, it stops. You're floating. It's a lot of fun.
The crew went through the preparation process. They reported we were ready.
Gemini 4.
I had a tracking station make sure that all of the safety criteria had been met, and this was now okay to open up the hatch.
Okay, we're giving you a go for your EVA at this time.
Okay.
Roger, flight, let's go. Okay.
After we got the hatch open, Ed stood up in the seat and got ready to go, and we cleared him to go, and then he took and pushed off from the seat.
Okay, my feet are out. I think I'm dragging a little bit, so I don't want to fire the gun yet. Okay, I'm separating from the spacecraft.
Ed White is flying at 17,000 miles per hour, 200 miles above the Earth.
Okay, I'm out.
If the spacesuit fails, the difference in pressure will kill him instantly. If the lifeline fails, he'll literally be lost in space.
The only thing to do would be to disconnect them and let them float around out there. I mean, it was, these are things that's in everybody's mind. We don't have a plan. We don't have a checklist on how you kill your best friend.
As White floats in space, a glove drifts out of the capsule.
Looks like a thermal glove, Jim.
I don't even know whose glove it was. I don't know whether it was his or mine.
I feel like $1 million.
Today, those pictures are a classic. They're still overpowering today to realize, number one, it's been done, and that we did it. It blew me away.
This is the greatest experience. It's just tremendous.
Ed White floats in space for 36 minutes, but has to be inside the capsule before day turns to night.
We told him to get back in the spacecraft, and he sort of didn't hear us. He didn't really want to recognize, that it's the EVA's over, time to get back in the spacecraft.
He was very reluctant to get back in. He was having a good time out there. I would have been reluctant to get back in, too.
Gemini 4, Houston, Capcom.
Yes, this is Jim. Got any message for us?
The flight director says get back in.
Okay.
I told him to get the hell back in the spacecraft because he was staying out too long. He was going to be out in the dark. That's the only time I've ever spoken without being spoken to into space.
EVA is NASA's riskiest mission yet, and a critical part of any flight to the moon.
Ed White's spacewalk will always be one of the genuine highlights of the space program.
Gemini 4 propels the space program a giant leap closer to the moon. At least until the next EVA. After the first U.S. spacewalk, Project Gemini tackles one of the most difficult procedures in the flight plan to the moon. Probes show it's possible to land on the lunar surface, but the moonwalkers will need to fly the lunar lander back to their orbiting capsule for the voyage home. It's called Rendezvous. It will demand the most precise flying of any mission. Astronauts for Gemini 7 are Commander Frank Borman and pilot Jim Lovell.
One of the things that we had to test out in Gemini was the ability to rendezvous with another vehicle.
They were start talking about using Gemini 7 as a target for Gemini 6.
Two spacecraft, Gemini 6 and 7, must find each other in orbit and fly just inches apart.
And in order to do that, we would have to have two Titans launch, one right after the other, on time. And we said, okay, we'll give it a try.
Rendezvous was absolutely critical. It involved a whole lot of work, and nobody had done it before. The main thing that I think everyone that was associated with any mission wanted to do was to do it well.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Engine start. We have a liftoff.
Gemini 7 blasts off first.
Okay, VC, stand by for staging. Roger, staging.
Rocket engines blasting off cause massive destruction. NASA crews have to rebuild the launch pad for Gemini 6 in just 3 days, a job that usually takes weeks.
You can tell them that the pad preparation schedule is going very well.
The pad preparation schedule for Gemini 6 is going real well.
Gemini 6 rolls out to the pad as Gemini 7 waits in space. Borman and Lovell will spend 14 days in orbit, America's longest mission, to study the effects of long-term weightlessness.
The maximum time to go to the moon would be about 2 weeks. A lot of the medical community said that there might be some body functions that don't perform.
Nobody had done that to that date. And so I launched with probes in my head. They even wanted to put a probe in an artery. I drew the line on that and told, no, I didn't think we'd do that this time.
As NASA prepares to launch Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford in Gemini 6, another test rocket is fired in the direction of Gemini 7.
Ignition.
We did that because the Defense Department was interested in tracking Soviet missiles.
Borman and Lovell test military technology to track a missile from space.
Every rocket has a signature that you can tell one rocket from a different type of a vehicle. And we had a device on board that was able to take that signature. It was kind of a little bit of apprehension to see this thing come towards you.
Back on the ground, Pad 19 is ready to launch Gemini 6.
The word from the Cape is, we are go.
The prime pilots for the Gemini 6 flight, Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, are now on their way to Launch Complex 19 to board their spacecraft. T-minus 48 and all still going well with our Gemini 6 countdown here at Launch Complex 19. We will have ignition at 0, and some 3 seconds after ignition, the launch vehicle will lift off on the start of the Gemini 6 flight. We've gone through a complete checklist once again, and we are counting.
2 to go. You're cleared for takeoff. Roger, adios. Minus 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Shut down, Gemini 6.
Fuel pressure is lowering slowly.
Roger, Gemini 6. Monitor take pressures.
Oxidizer pressure is down to about 32.
A faulty valve causes the engine to shut down, just seconds before the rocket would have exploded.
Okay, we're just sitting here breathing.
Here's 2 guys up there going through this trauma. We put the Titan on the pad and start the engine, and the damn thing shut down.
Stafford and Schirra are lucky to walk away.
Gemini 7, Houston. We were wondering if you saw the ignition at the Cape.
We were in perfect position, but we never saw the ignition. We were waiting for the liftoff.
With Gemini 7 waiting in space, Gemini 6 has the smallest launch window of any NASA flight.
And within 3 days, we fixed that issue, fixed that problem, and launched again.
Gemini 6, you are go.
You hear the man, go.
Go. 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Engine start.
We've got a real liftoff. The clock is running. Roll complete.
Roger, roll.
Cabin pressure sealed at 5.5. 50 seconds.
Okay, their orbit is 87 by 140.
From a lower orbit, Gemini 6 is catching up to Gemini 7.
How are the 7 boys doing? Did they go over a while ago?
They sure did. They're about 5 minutes ahead of you.
Roger.
But when Gemini 6 came up to rendezvous and we saw them coming up from below.
Hey, I think I've got it. Is that spacecraft 7?
There's nothing more the ground crew can do. The pilots are now in complete control. The 2 capsules, Gemini 6 and 7, are attempting to fly in formation, just inches apart.
Brink at 0.48 nautical miles. 660 feet.
We could have bumped each other. One of the things we want to make sure was, could you slow down? We didn't want to have a device where we misjudged our velocities and then slammed into each other.
300 feet.
It was still dark out, but we could see the jets firing from Gemini 6.
180 feet.
You're going 17,000 miles an hour. You're 200 miles up.
120 feet. Holding 120 feet, Wally.
No 2 spacecraft have ever been this close.
Holding 120 feet, Wally.
Ask them what their range is now.
About 20 feet. We're in formation with 7. Everything is go here.
Roger, congratulations. Excellent.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
They just came up and stopped, and there we were together. You know, nose to nose, side to side. It was a really fine sight.
We could see through the windows. We could see Tom and Wally quite well.
Gemini 7, this is 6. You can hold it in the yaw for just a little while. We'll try to get in real close and try to get all those close shots.
The 2 pilots fly their capsules in tight formation for 270 minutes, 3 orbits of the Earth.
The control system on Gemini was so good that you could fly within 6 inches of one another without bothering anything.
Rendezvous demonstrates how far the space program has come in just 4 years. And then it's over. Gemini 6 fires its thrusters and heads home. Lovell and Borman are alone in space again. Their remaining task, complete the 2-week mission, proving astronauts can survive a trip to the moon.
Tom and Wally spent a total of 19 hours in space. I would have gladly traded rides with them at that point.
By the time they left, the interior of Gemini 7 was getting to be, the odors were starting to float around, and 9 days had gone by before Frank looked at me and said, Jim, I think this is it. He said, I've got to go. I said, can't you wait 5 more days?
The last 3 days were bad.
It's NASA's longest mission in space, more than enough time for a round-trip flight to the moon.
Fortunately, Jim Lovell kept his wonderful sense of humor up, and it was no problem at all.
We were very happy when we got back down on the carrier.
Gemini 7 flies nearly 6 million miles in 14 days. In those 2 weeks, the sun rises and sets on Lovell and Borman more than 400 times.
It was very difficult to walk. My legs hadn't been used for 2 weeks, and I actually had to command my legs left, right, to walk down the deck of the carrier.
We learned one hell of a lot about how to do rendezvous.
With each Gemini flight, NASA acquires another skill necessary to reach the moon. One last critical maneuver remains: docking in space. The first crew to attempt it are Dave Scott and Commander Neil Armstrong.
Rendezvous, docking, and operating combined spacecraft was a key element of the Apollo strategy. We want to prove that ability on Gemini 8.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition, liftoff.
Armstrong will rendezvous, then dock their capsule with an unmanned Agena target vehicle, 160 miles above the Earth.
Hello, Houston. This is Gemini 8. We're station keeping on the Agena at about 170 feet. Okay, Gemini 8, everything looks good from the docking.
There was a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong and make the approach or the docking a dicey situation.
The flight, we are docked. Oh, roger. This is real good.
After a successful docking, combination began a slow roll. The roll rate became uncomfortably high. We were unable to determine the cause of the problem.
We got serious problems here with the forward coupling and overhead.
We disconnected our spacecraft from the Agena. Our roll rate continued to accelerate.
A thruster is stuck, spinning the capsule out of control.
Our orbit was primarily over ocean areas, out of range of flight controllers at tracking stations. We were on our own. When the roll rate increased to more than 400 degrees per second, our vision was beginning to degrade.
To regain control, Armstrong counters with a different set of rockets.
Neil Armstrong had to power up the re-entry control system in the Gemini spacecraft.
Fortunately, that solved the problem.
Armstrong steadies the spacecraft, but burns fuel he needs for re-entry, triggering an immediate abort of the mission. They have to settle for a backup landing site, far from recovery efforts already deployed in the Atlantic.
We were obliged to land at the next closest landing area, which was near the Pacific island of Okinawa. That remains as the record for the furthest distance from the original planned landing site.
Gemini 8 accomplishes its primary mission objective. The secondary objective, an extended EVA, is handed off to Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan on Gemini 9.
We were on a fast track to get to Apollo. We were flying a Gemini flight every 6 weeks.
There are 4 Gemini missions left. The moon now seems within reach.
Things changed when we got to Gemini 9.
To go to the moon, astronauts have to learn to work in the vacuum of space. Engineers scramble to devise new training techniques, but nobody really knows what working in weightlessness will be like. Gemini 9 will attempt the longest spacewalk yet.
We only had 20 minutes of spaceflight experience, and that was at White. Went out with a little gun, was able to propel himself around space and get back in without a great deal of difficulty.
It gave us a sense of, well, it looked kind of easy, frankly. We had a fairly complicated set of things to do on Gemini 9.
This is only our second walk in space, and we know very little about what we're going to encounter. This is a dangerous mission.
Gene Cernan has a lot of work to do on NASA's most ambitious spacewalk.
Gemini 9 was my first flight. I would have done anything I was asked to do. I knew I was good enough to do it.
And I was coming up an LOS, Gemini 9.
We opened the hatch. Tom Stafford held my feet down so I wouldn't just float out. And I just got the top half of my body out. I stuck my head out into truly a different world, if you will. And then my job was to crawl hand over hand to get back to the back of the spacecraft.
Cernan has to flight test a new jetpack mounted in the rear of the capsule. But just getting there is hard work.
I had nothing really to hold on to except a couple handlebars.
Okay, Tom, how's it look down there?
The vacuum of space offers no resistance. Even simple tasks are a massive struggle.
You're the most helpless creature in the world, on the end of a string floating in zero gravity in space.
What's up?
Suddenly realizing my visor was getting fogged up.
The visor fogged up. Here he was, in effect, blind.
It was obvious that he was in trouble.
And he was struggling like the devil to hold his location.
My heart rate was running 140, 50, 60 at times, 170.
Go ahead, 9. Okay, you're fogging real bad.
It was scary to us because you could hear this labored breathing, 20% past your max heart rate.
Doctors at Mission Control are seriously concerned he'll lose consciousness and not make it back to the capsule.
I couldn't determine the degree of the difficulties that he was in up there.
Go ahead, 9.
Cernan finally gets to the jetpack and straps it on, but he's too exhausted to fly it.
It was time to basically call the EVA off.
It was a nightmare getting back in the spacecraft.
The EVA is a failure. If a physically fit astronaut can't work in space, nobody's going to the moon.
Go ahead, 9.
I was disappointed. I didn't get the job done. I let my colleagues down. I was disappointed.
I don't think I'd like to do this again, would you?
2 more Gemini missions attempt spacewalks. Both fail for the same reason. NASA modifies the spacesuit and training methods. A rookie astronaut, Buzz Aldrin, will try again on Gemini 12.
Buzz Aldrin was the perfect guy for that EVA because he approached it in almost a textbook fashion.
An avid deep-sea diver, Aldrin practices for the next EVA underwater to simulate a weightless environment.
It was just a very natural thing to maneuver slowly from one position to another.
The tools, the techniques, the training, he made sure they got all put together in this new environment of neutral buoyancy training. He trained in there, he'd come back up, he'd say what he had learned, what needed to be done differently. You had the divers, you had the instructors watching this thing, and all of a sudden, these things made sense to us.
I had sufficiently rehearsed the different parts of it so that I felt quite confident that everything I had to do would leave me in a very positive control condition.
NASA has one more chance to get it right. Aldrin's first mission will be Gemini's last. Aldrin conducts 3 EVAs. he spends more than 5 hours walking in space.
Buzz learned not to fight zero gravity, but to use zero gravity to his advantage.
I actually felt a little guilty about doing such simple tasks in the back of the spacecraft.
He never got overheated. His heart rate never went up because he learned to take it easy. He had the proper tools, he had the proper footholds, and we learned a lot about how we could proceed in the future.
From that day on through to the current day, we have never had a major problem associated with the conduct of an EVA.
Project Gemini ends in triumph. The stage is set for our greatest adventure.
Gemini was an unsung hero in terms of the readiness of the American space program to go do Apollo in many, many ways.
We had learned the new technologies of space. We had learned to work with computers. We had learned to navigate. We had learned to dock.
Perhaps the most important way was to create the team of people, the band of brothers, that were ready to go to Apollo when the time came.
By the time we finished Gemini program, we had a solid foundation in technology, we had the solid foundation in a team, and we had the confidence to use the team and the technology now to take the step, go to the moon.